Good afternoon, everyone. Russell Holden with Render Plus Systems. Welcome to today's webinar. Our topic is rendering SketchUp models. The software application that we'll be using today is a very popular plugin for Trimble SketchUp called IRender Next. And IRender Next is developed by Render Plus Software in Centennial, Colorado. I want you to know that I don't have any expectation that you have experience with a high-end rendering program, and so we're going to take this nice and easy today, go through a lot of very interesting topics, show you the IRender Next features that make it easy to create photorealistic renderings with your SketchUp models. We have at Render Plus Software a number of resources that you'll find very helpful, and among them is our YouTube channel. Point your browser to YouTube, look for the Render Plus Systems channel. There you'll find lots of videos, including tutorials and nice explanations of IRender Next features and functions. Additionally, visit renderplus.com, where you will also find comprehensive documentation on our software. You'll find our updated webinar schedule. We are putting together webinars frequently, focusing on specific rendering topics. I think you'll find many of those interesting. Register for as many webinars as you want. Our webinars are always free, and we do our best to record them and then publish them to our YouTube channel. You might want to bookmark our YouTube channel, Render Plus Systems, and bookmark renderplus.com as well. You'll find them to be very helpful resources as you're learning how to use our software. You know, the wonderful thing about SketchUp is that it really can be used to build models of anything. And since I don't know specifically how you're using SketchUp, I'm going to use a couple of examples today to illustrate IRender Next features. One of them is this nice little wooden table. This is loaded directly from the 3D warehouse, and once loaded, we can expect that it's ready to render. That's what we'll be doing today. Secondly, this is also from the 3D warehouse. This is a beach cottage. Once we open these models, we don't make any changes. We just expect them to be ready to render. I'll show you that here in a few minutes. We'll render this model up as well, and we'll use some very nice IRender Next features to enhance the rendering that gets generated. Then lastly, I did create on my own a very simple interior. I'm going to use this interior to show you how to add artificial lighting to a model, and then we're going to have a lot of fun adding reflections. Two features that are very important in creating high-end renderings are the addition of artificial lighting and the management of lights, and then also the addition and management of reflections on material surfaces. If you have questions while we're going through this information, please don't be shy. I have the questions board in front of me, and I'll monitor that during our webinar. When I see a question that comes up, I will pause, read the question so everyone can hear it, and of course answer the question. If we've passed by a topic and suddenly a question occurs to you, please ask anyway. I assure you that it is no problem at all to rewind a little bit. The most important thing is that you get your questions answered, and that by the time we're finished, you are confident with your newly acquired skills, can open up a SketchUp model and create some really nice renderings. I know that a lot of people who are attending today are not native English speakers. And so, if I'm speaking too fast, please use the question board. Type slow down, and that will remind me that I'm speaking too fast. I'll slow down and hopefully give everyone an opportunity to understand the explanations. I appreciate everyone being here today. Let's get started. We're going to talk today about rendering SketchUp models with IRender Next. Every now and then, the IRender Next toolbar might not load. If it doesn't, click Extensions and then click IRender Next Load. When you do, our toolbar appears. By default, this toolbar is going to install adjacent to the SketchUp toolbar. It'll be over to the right. You can, as I've done, peel it away so that your SketchUp window is not nearly as crowded. Makes it a lot easier to point and click on the IRender Next features. I want to also mention that in addition to our rendering programs, at Render Plus Software, we provide a variety of free extensions for SketchUp, and among them is a really nice library of materials called the NXT library. Again, this is a free extension that you can download and install, and then assign really nice materials to your SketchUp model. Our materials, by the way, are defined in a variety of options. For example, notice tile octagon. We have a high gloss, a low gloss, and a medium gloss option. So not only are we providing the material, additionally, we're providing reflective options so that you can make these materials more or less polished by just clicking on the right finish in the list. Let's start out looking at this nice little round wooden table. And I have a couple of things I want to show you. The first is when I open this model, I assume that it's ready to render. Ready to render means let's click the render button and generate a rendering. When I click the render button, this dialog appears. This is the rendering settings dialog. And this gives us a great opportunity to start talking about a concept in IRender Next called presets. We use this concept throughout our software. The lighting presets is specifically referencing natural lighting options for your model. Now the three in the middle are pretty easy to understand. They are toggling on and off the SketchUp sun. The two on the outside maybe are not quite so obvious, so I thought I would talk a little bit about these options. The first, of course, is Studio High Dynamic Lighting. It's a pretty easy idea to understand. If we took this table to a photographer studio, the photographer would set up lights around it, use filters, do all kinds of really interesting things, and when finished, deliver to me a nice professional photograph of my table. Studio High Dynamic Lighting uses the same idea. And so when we render the model, you'll notice underneath this table, excuse me, there are multiple shadows, not just one dark shadow generated by the sun. Studio High Dynamic is using a multiple light source solution to generate your rendering of your model. Now, when you render with IRender Next, a new window opens. This is our rendering window. And with IRender Next and the rendering window opened, you can post-process a completed rendering. You can do a couple of additional things that are quite interesting. For example, when I click on the top of this table, a dialog appears, nice little pop-up, and one option is edit the material. Now I want you to understand I am not going back to SketchUp in order to make a change to this material. In the IRender Next render window, I'm going to select Edit Material off of this pop-up, and the Edit Material dialog appears. We are editing the wood floor material. Now when I click the Default tab, here are 9 reflection presets. that are available with IRender Next. And all I want to do is I want to select reflective. That's going to make the top of this table appear considerably more polished. So I click reflective. Once I click reflective, I click OK. And now let's re-render the model. Now with Studio High Dynamic Lighting, I already pointed out that there are multiple shadows underneath our table from the multiple light sources. You'll notice the top of this table is now showing me how the wood will sample in bright direct light, that's over here on this side, with filtered light, really nice examples, and then of course in shadow. You might also notice that the appearance of the top of this model is as though the sun is shining down through to the table through a canopy of trees. That's how we're generating these multiple light sources. Studio High Dynamic is a wonderful place to start in rendering your model. Again, this is a natural light source only, not using artificial lights yet. You know, I thought while we were here, I would also point out this blue button on the IRender Next window. Frequently, what we recommend is that the first time you render a model, render it with a limited number of passes. For example, this model was rendered with only 10 passes. If that's a concept that you're not familiar with, it's actually not difficult to understand. This renderer refines the lighting and reflections and materials using an iterative process. The more passes that you allow the software to process, the more refined your model. A limited number of passes early on doesn't take very long to complete and allows me to see the model to make sure that my materials are lined up properly, that they're scaled nicely, and gives me a rough idea of how successful the lighting solution is going to be. The resume rendering function, and again, we got to that by pointing to this blue button, allows me to continue with more passes without starting again at 0. So for example, what we're going to do is we're going to double up the number of passes. Now we're going to go 20 passes, but interestingly enough, IRender Next is going to start at pass 11. So I already have 10 passes complete. Now we're going to process this rendering. I stopped it to show you that at pass 16, the rendering is considerably more refined. And now at pass 20, I have an even more polished version of my rendering. So the recommendation is open up a model, set a limited number of passes, let the software complete the rendering, and then if you'd like to see a more refined rendering of your model, continue with more passes. It's really not always necessary to return to SketchUp. So here's the completed rendering of my model using Studio High Dynamic Lighting only and lots of nice shadows underneath the table, very much like what a photographer would do for me if I were to take this table to his studio. Second model, a beach cottage. Again, loaded from the 3D warehouse. Once I load it, what I want to do is generate a rendering. This time, the lighting preset that I'm going to select is exterior with sun. That means that shadows are going to be created using the SketchUp sun position. Here's the completed rendering showing nice sun shadows from the SketchUp sun and also our rendering of the SketchUp sky, which is a nice, bright, clear sky. You'll notice the glass is reflecting blue. That's from the SketchUp sky. You'll also notice that the model is very nicely illuminated all around and beautiful shadows being cast. I would like to take an opportunity to make some slight improvements to this completed rendering. So I'm going to use some post-processing options that are available on the IRender Next render window. Once again, not necessary to take this rendering out to a third-party software, an imaging software, for example. Not necessary to go back to SketchUp and make some adjustments. Instead, what I'd like to do is make this image just a little bit brighter. Now, anyone who's used imaging software, these terms, brightness, contrast, burn, saturation, you're going to be very familiar with them. So when we just increase the brightness of this image slightly, we get a much brighter image. Now, the only thing that I'm kind of unhappy with is I've lost a little bit of the definition of the image. The remedy is to click the sharpen filter. The best place to look on this rendering is right over here on the left-hand side. You'll notice that brightening the image reduced the contrast quite a bit, and so I can't really see the shakes quite as well as before. When I sharpen the image, that detail comes back. So now I have better reflections in the glass, a brighter image, brighter daytime image, and I've restored the detail to my rendering. Again, I'm going to stick with the IRender Next render window, and I'm going to click the clipboard, which gives me the rendering options. Now, I'm not going to return to SketchUp, but I am going to change the lighting preset to the use of a high dynamic range image. And I'm going to use this image as both the background for my rendering and the lighting solution. Once I've selected HDRI Sky, by the way, I'm going to use the default image first. IRender Next has selected an image for me, and I'm going to just click Render. So when I do, I get a replacement for the sun position. The sun position is now being determined by this background, and I no longer have as a background the SketchUp bright blue clear sky. Now I have a sky that's a little bit more interesting with some clouds. Additionally, the reflections on my windows improved considerably because now instead of just this blue reflection, I actually have really nice clouds reflecting from my windows. Another post-process option are some special effects that we can introduce into this model. And again, we can do this on top of the completed rendering. It's not necessary to decide we want some special effects and then generate a whole new rendering. The one that I want to show you is a haze effect. And what I'm going to do is just introduce some haze between my building and this neighboring building. Now, on a completed rendering, it might seem a little bit complicated in terms of where to actually start the haze, but that's what this little button right here does, this little less than sign. If you click on this, you can actually just point to the model or to the rendering, and that'll determine, in my case, it decided that where I clicked was 70 feet away. Now all that's left is let's increase the strength of the haze. And again, without re-rendering, this haze is added to the completed rendering. You know, every now and then when you have a rendering that you like, it's a good idea to click on this floppy disk icon. That'll bring up this dialog that'll let you save your completed rendering in a variety of formats. The most popular, of course, JPEGs and PNGs. You can also, of course, save your image as an HDR image if you'd like. So I have this nice, bright daytime image of my model using an HDRI sky, and I introduce a really nice special effect, haze, to the background of my image. What I thought I'd do is introduce an idea in IRender Next that can be very helpful in helping you balance lighting in your completed rendering. This is called the Light Channels dialog, and we're going to use it to do some light balancing on our model. Now you'll notice that there is a light channel for the sun, there's one for the sky, and then there's three that I added one for some garden lighting, one for the porch light, which is right here, and then one for some recessed lights that I introduced underneath this shallow overhang. This rendering using an HDR image as a background also includes the sun. That's why I can see a shadow underneath this soffit and also here on the side of the building. Now I want you to notice what happens when I uncheck the sun. Watch the shadows. They go away. Now I was able to do this without re-rendering. Additionally, the sky background, the full-on brightness of the sky and any of these lighting channels is a value of 1. 0 is essentially turned off. What I'd like to do is I'd like to dim the sky channel. So I'm leaving it on, but I'm going to dim it down. So I went from 0.8 to 0.2. The sky is now considerably darker, starting to get more of an evening look for my rendering. Of course, once evening approaches, it's a good idea to turn on some artificial lighting. Now, in a little while, I'm going to show you how to add artificial lights. I added these earlier, and now all I'm going to do is use the lighting channels dialog. I'm going to flip these switches and turn these lights on. Anyone catching on yet that I started with a bright daylight rendering of my model, and then without returning to SketchUp, without starting a brand new rendering, I am post-processing my rendering, and I'm getting now an evening rendering that I can also save and take to my presentation with my client. So here's my evening rendering of my model. Now I did make one other change. I went back to the HDRI options and I selected another HDR image that's included with IRender Next and called Sunset. And I want to show you the influence that this HDR image has on my model. The bright daytime image is very blue, which of course is a neutral look on the model. But when I switch that to a sunset image, of course the sun is low in the sky and very red, and look what it does to warm up my model. So I've made two decisions that are important for my presentation. One is I really like the lowered shadows, and in addition, I also like the warmth that that HDR image added to my model. I want to show you an example of what an end user of IRender Next did with exactly the same goal in mind. On the right-hand side is an HDR image that's very neutral, a bright daytime image, and then the same end user re-rendered the model with a different background, and look at the difference in the color of the model. The reflections in the glass are different. We're going from bright daylight to a really nice sunset style image. Accomplished by doing one thing, swapping one HDR image for another, has a tremendous influence over the quality of the rendering. Similarly, using the light balancing technique that we just used, this is a rendering from another end user who inside this nice little wine cave has some artificial lights. The sun streaming in through. The top image is with the lights, the interior lights turned off just by flicking the switch off with the light channels dialog, and the bottom image is with them turned on. So very nice post-processing features in IRender Next. Commit your computer to a very nice high-quality rendering, and then take advantage of the post-processing features that we include to get more than one presentation image when you've completed some rendering passes. So here's my model again. now with a sunset image as the background and lighting. I just wanted to show you this one more time. On the left is my beach cottage rendered with a darkened sky background and my artificial lighting turned on. You'll also notice that all of my artificial lighting is very bright white. For the second rendering over here on the right, that's the sunset HDR image. And additionally, I modified these lights, and I'm going to show you how to do this in a few minutes. I modified the color of these lights to be a little bit warmer so that they look more like incandescent bulbs. A lot of flexibility in IRender Next to get renderings that are both realistic and are matching your style for the quality of renderings that you intend to produce with the software. So let's talk about adding artificial lighting to a SketchUp model. You know, I actually wanted to throw this one in because here, this has absolutely no artificial lighting. This is very bright sunlight streaming into this model. And because of the point of view that this rendering was created, it really does give you the impression that outside it is very bright. Look, notice there's some haze introduced, so it's apparently also maybe a little bit humid and hot. It's just a wonderful rendering created by an end user of IRender Next. Here's a slightly different approach that I think is also a wonderful model using quite a lot of artificial lighting. And notice that it is very bright and sunny outside, but there is no real direct sun entering into the space. So this is, you know, the sun is on the other side of the building. This created wonderful natural lighting inside of this room and then enhanced all the more by some very nicely placed artificial lighting. It's a beautiful rendering of a kitchen created by a SketchUp modeler who uses IRender Next to create their renderings. And I'm telling you, everyone, if you're new with this software, it will not be long at all. And you'll be creating renderings that are just as nice as this one. So we're now going to go to this little model that I created. And first, let's just talk about what it takes to add lights to a SketchUp model. The little chandelier, when you click it, brings up the Render Ready Components dialog. This is a really nice library of light fixtures with defaults for light bulbs, their brightness, and their colors already set. So if you did nothing but select a light fixture, a round fixture for example, and then clicked Create Place, these glue to the ceiling. Once you click the ceiling, we're going to just place 3. And once we've placed them, the next thing that I'd like to do, over my pictures in the room, I'd like to add some sconces. Those are available from the Render Ready Components dialog. Again, you can select them. You'll notice that you can change the light intensity if you want. By default, these are 60 watts. You can also change the color to any color that you want. We have default colors already set. And you can specify the lighting channel. If you leave lighting channel set to 0, IRender Next is pretty smart and will put these on an appropriate light channel for you automatically. So we'll place 1 over the first picture and then a second over the cat picture. And then lastly, I'd like to place 1 desk lamp on that shelf back there. So we'll select the desk lamp and then place it. Once that's done, good idea to generate a rendering. Because there is a window in this room, the lighting preset that I selected is interior, and I want the interior to include the SketchUp sun. So this is just going to switch the sun to on. And now we'll render the image. So here is the lighting solution for my model. You'll notice the sun streaming in through the window. All my lights are illuminating this model very nicely. But I think you will all agree that what this model lacks is realism. And realism can really be added to this model by paying some close attention to all of the materials in use and managing how reflective they are. No doubt about it that reflections add considerably to our impression of realism, just like lighting, and equally important. This is a rendering created by Rich Russ, who is an expert modeler and renderer and a user of IRender Next. Did a great job on this water, and notice how the reflections of the structure and the light are quite convincing. By the time we get done, here's the rendering I'm after. You'll notice that there's reflections on these pictures now, so they appear to have glass in front of them. The glass table is much more convincing. Additionally, the shade on my lamp is reflecting. The floor has kind of a fuzzy reflection, making it look like it's a satin finish on the floor, not necessarily a high polished bowling alley finish. I added reflections to this vase. I added reflections to the column. I added reflections to the chair. The point is that if you want your rendering to be really completed, leave no material in your model untouched. Make sure that you address them and set their reflective properties so that they will look more realistic. Now, before we start addressing all of the materials in this model, I thought it'd be a good idea to pick one object, one component in this model, and let's start talking about how reflections actually works. With no reflection set, the component will render as a matte finish. That means it'll reflect the light, the artificial and the natural light, but it isn't going to really reflect much other than the color of the object based on the brightness of the light hitting it. So you'll notice that there are, on this main dialog, a couple of things that we need to pay attention to. The first is and remember that this is rendered as matte, so the intensity of the reflection is set to 0. In other words, we've decided that this material is not reflective at all. Let's switch that. Let's look at this light and as if with the material rendered as a plastic surface. Now this plastic surface is not particularly polished, but what I do get is reflections of the artificial lights up in the ceiling. We can make this lamp even more reflective by selecting metal. Now, the interesting thing about metal is that the light and the reflection is influenced by the color of the metal. So even though, for example, this wall on the back is very white, you'll notice that the reflection of the wall is actually gold. That's because metal reflects heavily influenced by the color of the metal. The intensity of metal is set very high. That makes this lamp look as though it's brass and very polished, and the sharpness of the reflection is set to 1, making it even more polished and giving me almost a mirror-like reflection. Now here's a concept that some people find not so easy to understand. I'm going to check glossy, and I want you to watch what happens to my lamp. Glossy removes the polish from this lamp. However, you'll notice that because metallic is still checked, the light reflecting off of this lamp is being reflected in the color of the lamp. It's being very influenced by the color of the lamp. Now watch what happens when we uncheck metallic. When we uncheck metallic, the light's reflected in the color of the light. When metallic is checked, the light is reflected in the color of the material. When unchecked, the light is reflected in the color of the light. I hope that you all are seeing that you have a great deal of control over the quality of the rendering and over how materials that you've applied in SketchUp are going to behave when rendered. I went back to my lamp and I unchecked glossy, and then what I decided to do was I realized that when I'm looking at this lamp, it's going to be from way across the room. And so a lot of the detail in the reflection won't be so obvious, but I do want to make sure that it is apparent that this is a very nice brass lamp and very reflective. So the change that I made was I reduced the sharpness of the reflection from 1 to 0.6. Now what that accomplished for me, it spread out mostly the reflections of these lights in the ceiling. And so now when I'm back across the room, it'll be much more obvious that this is a very nice metal brass lamp. Again, that's a rendering decision to help the quality of my rendering. Here are the two side by side. Of course, a very polished lamp with a mirror-like reflection renders beautifully if you're up close, but what you'll discover is that to roughen up that surface a little bit by reducing the sharpness will improve the quality of the rendering when you're viewing this lamp from across the room. You know, this isn't specifically a reflections idea, but I did want to point out that this brick surface is actually quite nice and works very well for this room. The problem is it's a little bit flat, and so on the materials edit dialog, we do have some nice options. One of them, these are actually applying textures to a rendered material. And one of them is called auto bump. Now what auto bump is going to do is it's going to increase the contrast in this brick wall, and it's going to give it a much more three-dimensional appearance. And that'll be more obvious still when we change the view just slightly. This chair came straight from the 3D warehouse. I believe it's a Frank Lloyd Wright design, and the materials are quite nice. It's wood with a nice fabric seat. I wanted to make this chair pop out a little bit better from across the room. And so you'll notice instead of going to a preset, all I did was I bumped up the intensity of the reflection to 1. So this chair is going to, the wood on this chair is going to be very reflective, but then I lowered the sharpness considerably because I don't want it to look like a mirror reflection. I just want it to reflect light really, really well. So when I render the chair, this is the look that I want. So I get really nice highlighting on this very nice wood chair. Now what I did to these pictures is not going to be quite so obvious. What I wanted was I wanted these pictures to appear as though they had glass in front of them. My attitude with regard to modeling and rendering is don't overlook the obvious. The obvious thing to do is add another surface in front of the picture Set the material as glass and then render. And when you do, look at the nice glass in front of this rendering. So sometimes do the obvious thing. Lay one more surface, set it as glass, and then render. Now this table is obviously glass, this tabletop, and more interestingly, it's thick glass. Thick glass has some nice rendering options. So I right-clicked on the tabletop, I select Edit the Material, I get my Edit Material dialog, and I'm selecting from the presets Thick Glass, but I had one more change that I wanted to make. And the change that I wanted to make is that this glass is actually about a 1/2 inch thick. And what that means is that the default refraction value wasn't quite high enough for me, so I bumped it up. I believe that the default is 1.5. So I bumped it up to 2.45 to give me a lot more refraction. I also realized that the thicker the glass, the less light will make it through the glass onto the floor from the overhead lighting. That's controlled by setting caustic to on. And so when I do that, here's the rendering that I get. Notice how it makes the glass appear to be a little bit more tinted, not quite as much light gets through. Look at the beautiful reflection on the surface of this glass. Next, I wanted to point out that if you look at the edge of this rug before the reflection was added and it was set as thick glass, watch what happens now when it's rendered as thick glass. You can see the edge of that rug shift from refraction. Before refraction and after refraction. It's nice, yes, because that's what thick glass does. It refracts light as the light passes through and then reflects back. The floor is also very interesting. Now remember, I could select a preset and get wonderful reflections on this floor, but I wanted to point out that this floor is going to be finished with more of a satin finish. And so I've set the intensity, it's still more than half, so it's relatively high. And then the sharpness I've set really, really low. This is going to give me fuzzy reflections on this floor and therefore more of a satin finish. The completed rendering looks like this after only 50 passes. Very nice fuzzy reflections on this floor. I'm going to show you how to improve on that in just a few minutes. Now my vase, I also had some special considerations. And so, you know what? We're going right to the advanced stuff, everyone, because selecting presets works great. And 9 times out of 10, when you select a preset, it's exactly what you want. But sometimes you have a little bit more in mind. So this vase, here's what I've done. I've selected metallic as the type of material. So that's going to give me a very nice reflection, and it's going to be in the color of the metal, which in the case of this vase is ivory. So keep that in mind. We're going to get ivory reflections of everything. But then I went one step further, and the one step further I went was I set the transparency of this vase to 1. I hope that doesn't confuse anyone, but what it means essentially is this. I made the vase metal, but then I went back and I increased the transparency. And so what I'm going to get when I render this model is I'm going to get a glass vase. If I'd selected glass, glass is of course transparent, so I would get transparency in the same way that I'm getting transparency in this table and in this window. I didn't want it to be completely transparent. I want it to be more like colored glass. And so the way I accomplish that is set the material to a metal reflection, and then make it more or less transparent. and I get this beautiful vase sitting on this table. The column was originally rendered as though it were painted with a matte finish paint. I wanted to make that a little bit more reflective. You'll see there's a considerable difference. So now I have more of a glossy paint surface on that column. Again, here is my rendering before any reflections were applied at all. So the only thing I'm getting in this rendering is the materials and light bouncing off of these materials to generate the rendering. Once we apply reflections to the model, it gets much more convincing. Now, I let this rendering run for 1,000 passes. And it's a great way to point out that the more passes you process, the higher quality rendering you will achieve. Number of passes in most cases is far more important than the resolution of the rendering. This is a medium resolution rendering. It's not high resolution at all. Remember when I applied the auto bump texture to the brick wall? I hope that you appreciate the 3D relief that is so obvious in this brick wall now. Additionally, look at the wonderful, soft, fuzzy reflections on this floor. So it really does give that satin finish look that I was after. The column is finished with again, fuzzy reflections using the glossy technique. If I were to ask you, is that a metallic reflection applied or no? I'm confident that you know the answer is no, because I can see the gold from these sconce lights. Of course, that would not be the case if we used a metallic reflection. I want to show you the level of refinement that you get based on the number of passes that you permit. I ran my rendering for 5 passes, and when I did, it allowed me to see that this wall is going to render just beautifully. The lighting solution is going to work really well. I'll tell you, the one thing that concerned me was my reflections aren't particularly fuzzy. Well, this will help you understand how this technique actually works. Notice that I have in this floor a couple of reflections, multiple reflections of this light on this shelf. The more passes that get processed, the more those converge into a really nice fuzzy reflection. You know what, 20 passes, this is actually quite a nice rendering. And if I didn't have time to process more, had to get to my meeting, I would be quite satisfied to show this rendering to my client. Here we are after 50 passes. I'm glad I had a little more time because this is even better. And here we are at 100 passes. Even better still, especially over here on the right, these reflections are really, really nice. And I already have the impression of a really nice satin finish on this floor. The lighting solution is also refining very nicely. You know what? Here we are at 1,000 passes. This is a rendering that I would be very happy to show anyone. So here's the completed rendering for my presentation to my client. You know, you have some really nice options with IRender Next in terms of the types of renderings that you might produce. Don't overlook on the renderings dialog the opportunity to create a panoramic image. And you will find on our website, if you go look at the discussion on panoramas, there are open source, that means free to you to use either for personal or commercial use, doesn't matter, web-based 360 viewers and standalone viewers that you can use in your presentations. Now, because we're doing this as a webinar this afternoon and I'm streaming this over the internet, there is a little bit of lag if we do this on the fly. So what I did was I captured several of the images from my viewer and captured from this panoramic image. This is a 360 panoramic. It was rendered 4,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels, I can tell you that with all of the lights and reflections, that rendering did take quite a bit of time to complete. This is, I think, 200 passes, and I let it run overnight in order to get it completed. But it was worth it because I got some really nice renderings of this space as a result. So you can cut these out and just take renderings of the space. You can also, I think, clients are still pretty impressed when you can walk into a presentation, hand them the mouse and let them spin around inside the space. It's still a lot of fun to do, and I assure you, your clients will remember it. I hope that this was a meaningful webinar for everyone this afternoon. We've covered quite a few topics that are all hopefully giving you some confidence in opening up SketchUp models, adding some artificial lights, managing the brightness of those lights, using our light channels dialog to balance the light when the rendering is completed, and then of course adding reflections to materials to make your renderings look more realistic. I want to invite you to send any questions that you have to support@renderplus.com. We are always monitoring our emails to make sure that if you have a question, we'll get them answered for you. I think tomorrow, probably about midday Mountain Daylight Time in Colorado. So whatever that translates to your time zone, go visit Render Plus Systems on YouTube and look for today's webinar. I'll have it published there by tomorrow. That'll give you an opportunity, if you have other people in your office who are curious about IRender Next, might want to learn a little bit more about the product. Maybe you're considering adding a few more people to your rendering team. Have them take a look at this webinar to get a nice introduction to our software. Again, visit renderplus.com for our upcoming webinar schedule. I'll be publishing September schedule very soon, and I hope you'll join me again. Thanks very much, everyone, for attending this afternoon. Hope to see you again real soon.